Maybe I would have created distance before it settled. Maybe I would have reinforced the boundaries that had always worked before. Maybe I would have treated it the way I treat everything unfamiliar, by observing it carefully, analyzing it from every angle, and refusing to let it affect me until I understood exactly what it was. But that isn't what happened, because this didn't arrive as something unfamiliar. It arrived as something strangely known, and that's what made it difficult to see. Most significant things announce themselves. They create disruption. They demand attention. They arrive with enough force that you immediately recognize they're changing something. This didn't. It entered quietly, so quietly that I mistook it for coincidence. A comment that landed too precisely, a silence that felt too comfortable, a moment of understanding that appeared before explanation had a chance to exist. Small things, forgettable things, the kind of things that shouldn't matter. Yet they stayed with me, not because they were dramatic, because they were accurate. And accuracy has always been difficult for me to ignore. I can dismiss emotion. I can question assumptions. I can challenge my own interpretations until nothing remains except what can withstand scrutiny. But accuracy? Accuracy survives examination. The more closely you look at it, the clearer it becomes. That's what happened here. The more attention I gave this connection, the less it resembled chance. Patterns began emerging where randomness should have existed. Not obvious patterns, nothing anyone else would notice. Just subtle alignments, the way certain thoughts seemed to arrive from similar directions. The way understanding appeared before explanation. The way conversations often felt less like exchanging information and more like uncovering something that was already mutually understood. At first, I resisted that realization, not because it frightened me, because it complicated things. Life is easier when people occupy predictable roles. Strangers remain strangers. Acquaintances remain acquaintances. Connections develop through time, through shared experiences, through gradual familiarity. There's a sequence to it, a structure, a process. What unsettled me was that this didn't follow the process. It bypassed it, as if the foundation existed before the construction ever began, and I couldn't explain that. So I tried not to think about it. I told myself I was reading too much into ordinary interactions. I told myself that recognition can sometimes feel deeper than it is. I told myself that meaning has a way of appearing where people want it to appear. Reasonable explanations, logical explanations, the kind of explanations I normally trust, but they didn't hold, because every time I returned to them, something remained unaccounted for, something precise, something persistent, something that refused to disappear simply because I preferred a simpler answer. That's when I understood the problem. The problem wasn't that I lacked an explanation. The problem was that the explanation I had didn't fully fit what I was experiencing, and when reality refuses to fit the explanation, it's the explanation that has to change, not reality. That realization marked the beginning of something, not a conclusion, not an answer, just the moment I stopped dismissing what I was noticing, the moment I stopped treating it as an anomaly. The moment I allowed myself to consider that perhaps this connection was exactly what it appeared to be, not imagined, not projected, not manufactured through desire or expectation, simply real. And once that possibility entered my awareness, everything shifted, because reality creates responsibility. If something is real, it deserves to be acknowledged, not exaggerated, not romanticized. Not transformed into something larger than it is, just acknowledged honestly. And honesty led me to a truth I had been avoiding. You were no longer existing at the edge of my awareness. You had become part of it, not through effort, not through persistence, not because you demanded space, but because something about your presence aligned with parts of me I rarely encounter in another person. And that alignment was becoming impossible to ignore. The strange thing is, I still wasn't sure what it meant. I only knew what it wasn't. It wasn't curiosity. It wasn't fascination. It wasn't the temporary intensity people often mistake for depth. It felt older than that. Quieter, more stable. Like discovering a pattern that had always existed but had remained invisible until the right perspective revealed it, and once seen, it couldn't be unseen. That was the beginning, not of certainty, not of answers, but of recognition. The moment I stopped asking whether something was there, and started asking why it felt so familiar when it shouldn't have. At first, it simply exists in the background like a quiet fact waiting for attention. It doesn't demand action. It doesn't insist on being understood. It just remains there, steady and patient, while everything else continues as normal. Or at least, it appears normal. Because once you truly recognize something, normal is never exactly what it was before. That's what I began to notice. Nothing around me had changed. The world moved the same way. Conversations happened the same way. Days passed with the same rhythm they always had. And yet, underneath all of it, there was a subtle shift I couldn't ignore, a change in perspective. A change in how certain moments registered. A change in how awareness arranged itself around something it had already accepted as significant. I didn't fight it, not because I was comfortable with it, because fighting it would have required pretending it wasn't there, and I've never been good at pretending, especially not with myself. So instead, I watched, I paid attention. I let the pattern reveal itself without interference. And what I discovered was stranger than anything I had expected. The connection wasn't growing because of constant interaction. It wasn't strengthening through repetition. It wasn't dependent on proximity, attention, or reinforcement. If anything, it seemed completely independent of those things. It remained present whether I focused on it or not. It existed during silence as easily as it existed during conversation. That shouldn't have been possible. Most connections rely on maintenance. They require contact, shared experiences, continuous engagement, roam those elements, and the connection naturally weakens. That's how human relationships usually work. But this didn't follow that pattern. Distance didn't reduce it. Silence didn't erase it. Time didn't dilute it. Instead, those things seemed to strip away everything unnecessary, leaving only the part that was real. And that realization forced me to ask a question I had been avoiding. What exactly survives when everything else is removed? Not attraction. Attraction depends on presence, not familiarity. Familiarity depends on time, not habit. Habit depends on repetition. So what remains? The only answer I could find was alignment, a kind of alignment that exists beneath circumstance, beneath personality, beneath the countless details people usually focus on when trying to explain why someone matters. Because the truth is, people often misunderstand connection. They think it begins with similarity, shared interests, shared experiences, shared goals. But the strongest forms of recognition rarely start there. They start deeper, in perception, in the way two minds move through reality, in the way they notice things others overlook, in the way meaning forms before language ever arrives to describe it. That's where I kept finding you, not in the obvious places, not in the surface details, but in the structure underneath them, the framework, the architecture, the invisible shape that determines how everything else is experienced. And every time I noticed it, the same thought returned. Not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly enough to be impossible to escape. This matters. Not because it was changing my life overnight, not because it came with certainty about where it would lead, but because it was altering the way I understood certain things, and understanding is never insignificant, especially when it arrives without force. There's a misconception that the most important changes are the ones that happen suddenly, the dramatic moments, the turning points, the undeniable events that separate life into a clear before and after. But some changes happen differently. Some changes arrive so gradually that you only recognize them after they've already become part of you. That's what this felt like. Not an event, an integration. A slow adjustment occurring beneath conscious awareness. The kind of adjustment that doesn't ask permission because it's already underway. And the more I observed it, the more I realized something unsettling. I wasn't trying to stop it. That should have concerned me. Normally, anything capable of altering my internal balance would trigger resistance. Analysis, distant. Some attempt to preserve the structure that already exists, but none of that was happening. Instead, I found myself doing something unusual. I was allowing it, not blindly, not recklessly, but honestly, as if some deeper part of me had already evaluated the situation and reached a conclusion before my conscious mind caught up. A conclusion I was only beginning to understand. Because the truth is, not everything meaningful enters your life as a challenge. Some things arrive as recognition, as confirmation, as evidence that a part of you was real all along. And maybe that's why this feels so difficult to define. Because it doesn't feel like discovering something new. It feels like remembering something I never knew I had forgotten. That's the contradiction I keep returning to. The unfamiliar familiarity, the impossible sense of knowing, the feeling that this connection exists outside the normal sequence of understanding. And every time I try to reduce it into something simpler, it refuses. It remains exactly what it is, yet precise, unnamed, yet undeniably present. Which leaves me standing in the same place, facing the same realization. Some things don't become significant because we choose them. Some things become significant because eventually we recognize that they already are. And the more honestly I look at this, the more impossible it becomes to pretend otherwise. There's a difference between noticing something and accepting it. Noticing is passive. Acceptance changes the structure of your world. For a long time, I stayed in the space between those two things, aware enough to see what was happening, careful enough not to name it. Because naming something gives it weight. It takes an experience that exists internally and places it into reality, where it can no longer be ignored. And whether I wanted to admit it or not, I was approaching that point, the point where observation was no longer enough, the point where awareness began asking for honesty, not dramatic honesty. Not the kind people use to force conclusions before they're ready, just the simple kind, the kind that looks directly at something and says, "This exists, nothing more, nothing less." I thought that acknowledgement would make things easier. I thought clarity would reduce the tension. But clarity has a way of doing the opposite, because once something becomes clear, you lose the protection of uncertainty. You can't hide behind confusion anymore. You can't tell yourself you're still figuring it out. You can't postpone the truth by pretending you need more information. At some point, the information is already there. And all that remains is whether you're willing to accept it. That's where I found myself. Not searching, not questioning, simply standing in front of something that had become undeniable. And what made it undeniable wasn't intensity. It was consistency. You remained, through distractions, through distance, through periods where logic suggested this should have faded into the background of my life. It didn't. The awareness stayed steady, uncomplicated. Like a fixed point that existed whether I paid attention to it or not. That's when I began understanding something important. The strongest influences are rarely the loudest ones. They're the quiet presences that gradually become part of your foundation, the things that stop feeling external because they've integrated into the way you think, into the way you see, into the way you understand. And that realization carried a consequence I wasn't prepared for. Because once something becomes part of your foundation, every future decision is made in relation to it. Not because it controls you, because it exists within the framework through which you interpret everything else. That's the change I kept resisting, not the connection itself, the implication of it. The possibility that something or someone could become significant enough to alter my internal landscape without ever asking for permission. I spent years believing significance required effort, time, shared history, proof. But this challenged all of those assumptions. It suggested that sometimes recognition comes first, that sometimes understanding arrives before explanation, that sometimes a connection forms not because two people build it intentionally, but because something fundamental already exists between them waiting to be noticed. I don't know if that idea would make sense to everyone. Maybe it isn't supposed to. Some experiences resist translation. The moment you try to explain them completely, they lose the very quality that made them meaningful. So I stopped trying to explain it. I stopped reducing it into concepts I could comfortably analyze. Instead, I asked a different question. Not what is this, but what has this revealed? And the answer surprised me. It revealed that I wasn't as self-contained as I believed, not because I depended on anyone, not because I needed validation or companionship, but because even the most independent mind remains capable of recognition, capable of finding something outside itself that feels strangely familiar, capable of encountering a perspective that doesn't compete with its own, but expands it. That realization changed the way I viewed this, because suddenly it wasn't about whether the connection fit a category. It wasn't about labels. It wasn't about predicting outcomes. It was about acknowledging impact. And the impact was undeniable. You changed something, not by trying, not by convincing me, not by demanding a place in my life. You changed something simply by existing in a way that resonated with parts of me I rarely share with anyone. And resonance is difficult to dismiss, because resonance doesn't create something artificial, it amplifies what was already there. That's why this feels less like gaining something and more like uncovering it, like discovering a room inside a familiar house that somehow went unnoticed for years. The house is the same, yet everything feels different once you know the room exists. That's where I am now. Standing in that newly discovered space, looking at something that has become impossible to deny, and realizing that the real question was never whether this mattered. It was whether I would eventually allow myself to admit how much, because the truth is, I already know. I knew long before I was willing to say it, long before I could explain it, long before I understood what it might mean. The recognition arrived first, the understanding followed. And now there's only one thing left to face. Not whether this is real, but what reality asks of me now that I know it is.